the place on fire now.
That's a fitting song, eh? Mass again. You know, it's like every day is mass. Even when it's not carnival, we're having mass in Trinidad and Tobago. So welcome back, everyone. So Acting Police Commissioner Erla Christopher has topped the list of candidates for the post of Police Commissioner. Her name has now been submitted to Parliament for debate this Friday. To speak with us on this latest development is Attorney at Law and former member of the Police Service Commission, Martin George. Mr. George, good morning.
Yeah, hi, good morning to you, Marlon, and good morning, Trinidad and Tobago.
Mr. George, is this a done deal?
Well, not necessarily, Marlon, because if you recall, when the list had been submitted, where you had former Commissioner Gary Griffith, who was eventually chosen by the government, there were 3 other persons who actually were on the list ahead of him. So the first person who topped that list was not accepted by the government. The second person was not accepted. The third person was not accepted. Those 3 persons were Stephen Williams, you had Howell Phillips, and you had Mr. Dulal Chan. So 3 persons who were ahead of Mr. Griffith were rejected by the government until they dug down deep into the list to get the person whom they wanted. Because the situation, even though they have removed the prime ministerial veto, it is really still subject to the majority in the House of Parliament, and that majority is with the government, and therefore basically it's still in effect is almost whom the government wants to select from that list.
I think since last evening, and when you compared this time around to the last time, we were hearing a number of names, and we were hearing it not by the wayside, but as a matter of record, official names on a list. Is it that this time, from the announcement yesterday evening, I get the impression that there's something different this time around, where we are only seeing one list up to this, one name up to this point?
Well, the thing is, when one considers the amendment which was made in 2021, all right, so that's legal notice 277 of 2021, right? So that amendment, by that legal notice that was made in 2021, that amendment legal notice 177, no, 277, I'm sorry, 277 of 2021, that legal notice sought to make an amendment that suggested that one name shall be forwarded to the president. So if you recall the debacle that occurred previously with the list and with some apparent meeting and some supposed or alleged intervention in relation to when that list was submitted, which led to the collapse of the former Police Service Commission. This amendment seeks to cure that by speaking of one name being submitted to the president. However, Marlon, when one looks at the section 123 of the Constitution, there appears to be an unresolved issue, because section 123 of the Constitution still speaks to the Police Service Commission submitting a list to the president. So in other words, a merit list as opposed to one name. So at the top of the merit list, of course, would be the candidate who has topped everything. However, it still appears that if it is that it's subject to 123 of the Constitution, then there still may be a list submitted to the president, and the president may then forward one name to the Parliament.
All right, let me ask a question that members of the public may want to know. How can one top a merit list and not be appointed police commissioner? On what grounds?
Because the Constitution still allows the nomination to be subject to parliamentary majority. Before, it was actually just a simple prime ministerial veto. So if the prime minister didn't like you, you didn't stand a snowball's chance in hell. You recall that prime ministerial veto was exercised when Stephen Williams was first nominated to Parliament, and then Prime Minister Manning exercised his prime ministerial veto and, ensured that Stephen Williams was not appointed as the substantive commissioner. The law was then changed to supposedly remove the prime ministerial veto, but it remained still subject to the parliamentary majority. If the prime minister is head of the cabinet, head of the government, and the government is the one that has the parliamentary majority, then it still basically comes down to a question of, if the prime minister doesn't like you, then I guess he will speak to his members and they will vote against you. So it comes back down to that scenario where basically it is still a question of whom the government wants or doesn't want.
Mr. George, let's speak about the Police Service Commission. You being a former member of the Police Service Commission, but why is there always a delay in having someone appointed to the post of police commissioner? Persons may say, well, look, that's one of the main jobs of the Police Service Commission. The PSC should know when the term of the person who is sitting in the post at that time comes to an end. So why is this apparent rush, all of these mistakes, and the PSC behaves like it does not know what is happening?
Well, the thing is, in fairness to the Police Service Commission, one has to understand that it is constrained by the legislative underpinning and the constitutional framework within which it is enshrined. So you are limited by the legislation, and you are supposed to act in accordance with the legislation. The legislation at times has been a bit convoluted, and it makes the process more difficult than it ought to be. And I have said repeatedly that it is easier to appoint a prime minister, a chief justice, or even a president in Trinidad and Tobago than it is to appoint a police commissioner, because of the fact that we have made this process so involved. And of course, you still have it in a scenario where it has to now be laid in Parliament and the Parliament has to vote on it. So once that remains our legislation, I don't think that any police service commission is going to have an easy job. Of course, managing the process is part of your mandate as the Police Service Commission, and you ought to be proactive, you ought to be on top of your game, you ought to be fully conversant with the laws and regulations guiding you and dictating how you are supposed to function. But still, we have seen some horrendous missteps in the past, which we hope will never be repeated again.
And I think that's the question, in that Trinidad and Tobago expects that the persons appointed to the Police Service Commission are professional people, are bright people, are educated people, and then when the time comes to appoint a new police commissioner, you have all of these problems still plaguing the process. And as I said, it also seems that there's always a rush and that the time has run out to appoint a new police commissioner.
Yes, and in those circumstances, I think certainly there can be no excuse, because if someone is on a fixed term contract, or if it is that someone is due to retire and the fixed date of retirement, then of course things ought to be put in place in a timely manner to ensure that this gets done, in the most expeditious manner. However, we have to recall, Marlon, that previously the process was even more convoluted than this, where you had, remember, Penn State University used to have to, do the vetting process, and they had to design the exam and the psychometric tests and that sort of thing. And then you had to fly in candidates from overseas, who may have applied. So, it has become simpler, and hopefully we will see a smoother transition in this iteration of the Police Service Commission. However, one still has to await what our parliamentarians will do, because, as I said, it has to be laid in the parliament, and of course there has to be debate upon the candidate, and of course there will be a vote as to whether this person is accepted or not.
Yeah, I think, Mr. George, we both agree, and persons out there may agree, that the process needs to be, I don't want to say a simpler process. I don't want to give the impression that it needs to be simple, but there has to be a smoother process, if I can put it
And
that
not just
way.
that, the thing is, there has to be a streamlining of the process such that, you know, and I mean, part of the challenge, Marlon, is that what we really need is full-time commissioners, because what often has been the case is that you have commissioners who are basically volunteering their time on a part-time basis. Most of them are busy professionals otherwise, and they really do not always have the time to devote to this on a full-time basis. So I think the government needs to look at maybe appointing full-time commissioners, maybe for a 3-year term, and after your 3-year term, maybe of course you could be replaced, but you need persons who are able to deal with this on a full-time basis, and I think that would help in terms of managing the process even better.
Mr. George, if I can pull you into another direction now, a major development yesterday evening concerning the Vindra Naipaul Coolman matter and the 9 persons who would have faced the courts and who would have been freed in connection with this matter. They have been awarded $2 million each.
Well, actually, it's more than $2 million. $2 million is
And some change.
damages, and then, of course, there were the exemplary damages on top of that, and then you have interest on top of that. So I think when you tally it at the end of the day, it could reach to maybe 2.5 for each person. Now, the question that I think the nation needs to ask is, where did the state or the Attorney General's office drop the ball in this matter? And I say it in those terms because, first of all, in terms of the state, if you are prosecuting such a high-profile matter and you have 9 persons whom you have charged, one would assume, Marlon, that you have done your due diligence, you have done your investigation, you have gathered your evidence, you have consulted with your senior police officers. The senior police officers would then have consulted with the Director of Public Prosecutions. They would have reviewed the evidence. They would have assessed and weighed it. All of this before even laying the charges. So you ask yourself, having gone through that process of rigorous scrutiny, how is it that, first of all, in 2016, the case collapsed, and, Justice Malcolm Holdup discharged all 9 accused? What happened there? And this is where I think a certain level of accountability needs to come into play, Marlon. I think in any civilized country in the world, you would have persons being fired or dismissed over these types of scenarios. But in Trinidad and Tobago, it appears to be par for the course, and we sometimes see people being promoted after debacles such as this. You ask yourself also, okay, so this having collapsed and the men being discharged, the next question would be, when they filed the lawsuit for malicious prosecution in 2020, what did the Attorney General's office do? How is it that we are now hearing and reading that the state did not even defend the matter? That is, if that is true, then I think that's an appalling abomination to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, because you have a scenario such as that where they're making this claim and they were very clear and upfront in what they were seeking, because they made a claim for $3.5 million each. So therefore, the extent of the burden this is going to be on the Treasury and on taxpayers, on ordinary citizens, Marlon, you and I, and the man in the street. So you knew the import of this. And we are hearing and reading that it is said that the state did not put in a defense. We ought to call upon persons to be held to account for this. How could that be? How could the Attorney General's office not put in a defense in a matter such as this when you know that this has such serious implications? And then, Marlon, it gets even worse because you see that, okay, so having not put in a defense, judgment was entered against the state in the matter. And then you go to the question of assessment of damages, and you read that, okay, of course, the men were claiming $3.5 million each. And then you saw in the reports where it said the state countered an offer of $1.2 million. Who gave the instructions for the state to start off with an offer of $1.2 million? Who in the Attorney General's office would have signed off on this to say, well, look, we are satisfied that these men deserve $1.2 million each, that we start off our position with that? When you start off with that, then it's not surprising that the master came down, maybe around the $2 million figure, plus the 100 in exemplary damages. Because if they are asking for 3.5, and you as the state, not only you roll over and you basically surrender, you then also make a very, very generous starting offer of $1.2 million.
Mr. George,
it's abhorrent to the average citizen. And I think people are rightfully outraged by what has occurred here. And we ought to call upon the government officials, the state officials, to be held accountable for this devastating scenario.
Mr. George, is there room for appeal, or are we going to have to pay?
Well, yes, Marlon, of course there's room for appeal. But, as we often see in these scenarios, the state trots out someone to come and give a face-saving interview and say, well, this is not the end of the matter. We are going to appeal it. At this point, Marlon, all you're trying to do is stuff the go-bar back into the cow, because you have already conceded the substantive matter. You've already made your offer of 1.2 million. How do you climb down from there? It's as the Trinidad artist said, come down from there, but you cannot, because the point is you have already conceded these things and made these offers. So your hands are full of the go bar, and all you're trying to do is stuff it back into the cow. That's where the state is at this. So even if they appeal, it's not going to really make any serious change. It doesn't appear so to this scenario, because you started off by, first of all, not defending it, and then secondly, it appears from the record that you made an offer of 1.2 million. It's difficult to resile from that.
Mr. George, thank you very much for your highly descriptive and highly spirited contribution this morning. I'm just wondering, how do I continue after that? But thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Speak to you soon. Okay, right. It's time for another commercial break with a look at this image of Moko Jumbies enjoying the carnival.
Master, come again. Well, look how the place on fire now. Master, come again. A spirit to bring